Let's get started, guys. Okay, cool. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for coming.
There's got to be more people than this coming.
Are there? What time do you think we should start then?
Just 10 past.
10 past?
Yeah.
All right.
I mean, you know, not
Okay.
to be candid, people in here all already been to an economics session, so.
Yeah.
You're a treasurer.
Yeah. Well, this is embarrassing. Economics and accounting. That's microeconomics. This is macro.
I sleep very well at night knowing lots of
shit about
Why do you want that?
of an economic illiterate.
You don't need, like, economics. See the Treasurer of Australia.
Why is every cell
This is true.
That's quite strange. Well, I don't have time to get chips, do I?
Yeah, you do.
Yeah.
This
If you got 3 minutes.
Vicary might actually be.
Who is this? What?
No, I'm here on because unfortunately I no longer have Peter and Ben on my team to tell me things about economics. I got an art student and red kid.
This session was advertised on Monday, yes?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. And Facebook.
Why do people not show up for it?
It's like the last Wednesday before. Yeah.
Yeah, but I seems like there were a lot of people who responded to the Facebook post.
True.
I thought a lot of
They wanted it, I think
Maybe
that's when they found out it was being recorded.
I think a lot of people were
True.
also like exhausted from the fact they did sick like debates on the weekend.
Yes.
And
Yes.
more debates on Monday.
They've got to learn to let debating take over their lives.
Hey, mate.
Hello. Oh,
I thought Stephen would be here, though.
Chicken or something?
Stephen 2.0.
Sorry?
Yeah.
He wasn't there on Monday either, so.
He went on boat cruise last night.
I remember seeing him on Monday.
Yeah, he wasn't.
I thought I saw him.
He certainly wasn't in the debate.
Okay.
Well, it may not have been a good debate, but... Also, Keith, when you said last election, you mean the one that's just come, or the one before?
The one that just happened.
I don't know, and if they did lose seats, it was probably to the Liquid Party.
Yeah. What happened?
Jewish Home lost seats. We made a big thing about them in our World's debate about Israel.
I think that's true. Yeah.
Yes, IR, second least favourite type
Okay,
of
so
debate.
$5 just summary sheet coming out Israel Palestine. Do you want to have $5?
If you wanted briefings about our hotspots, it's too
Unless I
late.
get the $5 for just saying that. Not really.
Gemma's got a session used that it hasn't changed that much.
Since when? IR. Surely it's changed. Hey, Stephen.
Well, that's the great thing about it. That's about the great thing about Israel Palestine. Because it's irresolvable, it never changes.
Israel Palestine,
Israel
perhaps.
gets gradually more conservative, but that's about it.
No.
It's starting in a minute. What's up? Ooh, the magical word. It's so scary. Dollars equal sand. Yes. Well, if the government made it fiat money, if it was government decreed that sand had value, then yes, it would be money. Yeah. See, I convinced you of an argument that probably doesn't really stand. So. All right. All right. Stephen, would you like to close the door? Thank you. Yeah. Oh well. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. So, given the crowd today, what I was originally going to do was trying to give you a broad understanding of some economic topics and then get you used to some sort of economic arguments and common economic arguments that can apply to a lot of debates. But because of the high quality in the room, I think we can go into a little bit more advanced stuff after covering a brief sort of basics of most of these topics. So let's firstly go into the aims of the government, or what you try to achieve when you have an economics debate. What are you trying to maximize when you have an economics debate? You want to usually have high economic growth, high employment, and price stability of generally three main things. So you don't want to have really big inflation, big changes in the exchange rate, or big changes in interest rates. And those things are usually covered by monetary policy, and that's done by the central bank, whereas fiscal policy is done by the government itself. And the government provides things like healthcare, education, defense, and all those other things, and you can broadly consider them as welfare in society. So you want to maximize these things, or I'll get to a little bit in a moment about the sort of fiscal policy analysis. You trade off a lot of money for that. Yes, Keith?
Why is price stability important?
Price stability is really important because it means that people can just live lives normally. So let's say if we have really high inflation, for example, or changing inflation, that people have to they have to go and get all this extra money, and prices change frequently in order to compensate for that. So, for example, just before in the Weimar Republic, when they had hyperinflation in Germany, governments paid for things using monetary policy, and it created a lot of inflation, and then that meant that the price of, say, a loaf of bread started from like $5 to $100 to $1,000, and that meant that they had to like increase the wages of those workers every month in order to keep up with that, and people ultimately lost out because inflation is a tax on people. And the same thing for exchange rates, because you can't buy as many things overseas, the economy takes a long while to adjust. Interest rates, for a very similar reason, because it's just like basically inefficient and a tax on people. Yes? Sure. Sure. Yeah. So monetary policy is conducted completely by the central bank. So that's decisions to lend money to, say, the government or to banks. And they also control inflation, exchange rates, and interest rates largely through the tools that they have. And that's basically that printing money or giving certain people money. And that's like they can control employment, price stability, and economic growth through those instruments that they operate under. Fiscal policy is just the government budget. If you hear that in the news, they've got a deficit. It's because they're spending. It's completely the government spending money on healthcare, education, those sorts of things. All right, so let's look at the first topic. So what is inequality? Inequality is where a certain proportion of society holds a certain proportion of wealth. So if it's the richest 1% owns 90% of that population's wealth, you would say that is a very unequal society, and they sit on the sort of perfectly inequality spectrum. Whereas conversely, if you have a society that has like the majority of people owning the majority of wealth, or that the wealth distributed among those people is very even, that you would have a very equal society. And here are some of the countries and where they sit. And it's not really good to be on either extreme, because what is either extreme? Perfect equality is communism, and perfectly unequal society is where like Bill Gates has all of the money. And neither of those are an efficient society or like one that you potentially want to live in. You might wonder why China has a question mark there. It's just because it's very, very difficult to find accurate information about China. And that like they have three very distinctive, different figures about how unequal their society is, depending on who you ask. So can anyone think of arguments why you might want, why inequality would be a good thing or why it would be a bad thing? Let's start with who can come up with an argument why you want an equal society. So how does that happen? Yeah, so you can buy like the same amount of stuff as everyone else, and you've got access to the similar things, and that's quite a good thing. Anyone else?
Well, I guess in terms of inequality, an argument against it could be entrenchment, so lowered social mobility.
Right. Okay. Cool. Yeah. So So you're saying an unequal society has like entrenched poverty for some people, right? Yeah, I think that's a fair argument. Here are some answers I prepared earlier. Usually, you can characterize a very unequal society that like inequality and like poverty is entrenched along racial lines, and this can cause a lot of racial tensions within a society. Like Ferguson is one example, but like in South Africa, 20% of their population is in extreme poverty, and it's basically 90% African people. It's not the white people that have they have all the money, and this is really bad because we want to live in a society that when you live in one, whoever you are, that you can access sort of the benefits of being rich, or like the reasonable same level. Can anyone tell me what the lottery of birth is?
So, like, it's a concept where you're born into something and that decides your life, and it's not based on anything. It's based on the characteristics of your parents and where you're born, not based on your inherent abilities.
Yeah. So we want to like have a society where it doesn't really matter where you're born, but like a society that like gives everyone equal opportunity. And that's kind of some of the arguments for why inequality is bad and why we want to have that in society. Yes, Andrew?
To put that in a slightly more formal context, it's the argument of John Rawls that in constructing the best possible society, you should do it from behind a veil of ignorance, where you do not know what your position in that society would be, and that from that position you can construct a society that treats everyone more or less equally once the lottery of birth has then been applied to them and circumstances dictated where in that society they'd be born. So if you want to know more about those arguments, look up John Rawls.
Yeah, absolutely. Great job, Andrew.
Continue going.
So why do we not want, like, what's the argument for an unequal society? Why don't we care about inequality?
It's not that you don't care, it's that you are willing to accept a large extent of it.
Mm-hmm. But in a debate where you have to say, like, actually inequality is a good thing, what were some of the arguments that you'd come up with? Yes?
So one of the ways to do this in debates is to not necessarily just say that inequality is sort of a priori good, but to make arguments about where the financial resources of our society should be concentrated. And you can make good arguments that they should be concentrated within a few individuals or within a few institutions that hold that capital, because those institutions or those people are good at making the large investments necessary to make large infrastructure projects, large development projects, make new factories, new businesses, all those sorts of things, rather than invested in people's ability to buy food or buy furniture or whatever. And the debate then becomes which of those two goals is the most immediately important for society as it is now. So analysing the context that you find yourself in then gives you those arguments.
Great, Andrew. That's really good. So, two other arguments that you could use. So that if you have a society that has an aspirational culture, when you have poor proportion of the society and really rich, is that you can actually flip that social mobility argument on its head and say that because there are really rich people in society, that they can buy from the poor their labor or their goods or services, whatever they make, and that those poor people can become rich, and that by seeing rich people in society, those poor people will work really hard in order to acquire that wealth. And you kind of characterize the opposition as being sort of a socialist state that you can never get any richer than your neighbor because the just opportunities aren't there. So you want to have a society where you can become the richest person, and we prioritize like innovation, like inventors, and like Steve Jobs, who wanted to become rich. He did what he did so he could be that upper echelon of society, and we prioritize that. Another argument is you could say that like inequality is not the most important thing. It is actually solving poverty, and that you solve poverty better when you focus on solving that rather than solving inequality. Can anyone tell me the difference between poverty and inequality?
Because you're saying that if you raise everyone up, so there's like a higher bottom line and less people will be starving, so there might still be people like way up there and some people way down there, but if there's a higher bottom line, everyone's overall better?
Yeah. Let's see what Margaret Thatcher has to say.
Very honourable gentlemen, there is no doubt that the Prime Minister one statistic that I understand is not, however, challenged, and that is that over her 11 years, the gap between the richest 10% and the poorest 10% in this country has widened substantially. How can she say at the end of her chapter of British politics that she can justify many people in a constituency such as mine being relatively much poorer, much less well-housed, and much less well-provided than it was in 1979? Surely she accepts that is not a record that she or any Prime Minister can be proud of.
Mr. Speaker, all levels of income are better off than they were in 1979. But what the Honourable Member is saying is that he would rather the poor were poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That way you will never create the wealth for better social services as we have. And what a policy! Yes.
Yes, she rants a bit after that. So.
At least their rants make sense.
Yeah. So what she's saying is that like the gap between the poorest and the richest will be up here, but like in a social society, the gap may be smaller, but the overall wealth per person is a lot smaller. So while inequality is a problem, yes, you can say that people are poorer as a society, even though they're more equal, but we prefer a society where everyone is richer. Even the poorest of the poor will be richer in a society that is less equal, and you can see this in places like China, for example, that like if they tried to aim for an equal society, that everyone would be poor, but they decided to have a more unequal society, and lots of people got really, really rich, and that meant that thousands of people have been pushed out of poverty because of it. So they solve poverty, if not inequality. That's a trade-off that you can make and prioritize in a debate. So let's now look at pie analysis and sort of tax. When you tax an economy, what happens? You can say that like in an argument where it's like we want to increase tax or decrease tax, these are like separate. So just think about this for a second. So let's say you have a 90% tax on all business in an economy. What happens is that like businesses can't operate successfully under a 90% tax threshold, that some businesses will choose not to go into like, let's say, a country like the UK, and that they'll go elsewhere, and that country's economy will be a lot smaller under a high tax. And then what will happen ultimately is that you will end up drawing in less tax than you would have if you had a really low tax system, because the pie of the amount of economic wealth in that society is a lot smaller. So even though you're taxing it at a higher percentage, you're getting less tax overall. Yes?
Doesn't that depend on the sensitivity of the quantity to the tax rate?
Absolutely, yeah. But this is just a common argument for like high tax or low tax, is that like it does depend on sensitivity, and that's where like actual policy debate comes in. But the theory behind having a low tax on business is that it stimulates the economy, and it means that people come in, like Singapore, for example, has really low taxes, and they're very successful as an economy, compared to like another country that has like super high taxes on business that doesn't attract that investment. So that's the sort of like tax analysis and how much you get more tax under a low system, arguably, or you might get less tax under a high system, and that's kind of like the conservative argument for tax on economics. Now, this is just a pie analysis of what happens like if you're trying to understand, this is kind of aimed at the novices in the room, that like this is what happens. Let's say this is under the status quo, and this is like if you're the affirmative proposing a model. You could say that, let's say the motion is that we should decrease tax for women. You can say the problem is that currently 40% of the labour force is made up of women and 60% of men. So in the status quo, that's a big problem that is currently happening. But when we decrease the tax on women, we get a lot more women in the labour force and pushes a lot more men out. And this is ultimately what's going to happen to the labour force in that particular country. So that's just before the model and after the model, and how the world changes in a sort of pie distribution analysis that you can think of. This is for the novices, to like how they can think of the world changing, if you like. All right, so big government versus small government. So it's basically how much more or less public healthcare, education, defense, security, all of the things that government provide, why should we have more of that or why should we have less of that? Can anyone think of why we would like a big government that provides really good education, social welfare, security and defense? Can anyone think of arguments for principally and practically why we'd want a big government? Andrew.
Well, a lot of those things are A, incredibly socially important and so should not be trusted to the vicissitudes of a market that sometimes fails. And B, benefit enormously from economies of scale, which means it's much easier to provide a lot of those things when you provide it in a larger scale. And C, are things socially important enough that their distribution should be equitable amongst the population, and so we should entrust that to a government rather than on people's ability to pay. So those are the basic reasons.
Excellent. Kelvin?
Well, I think that list, indeed. Many of those are public goods.
Yep.
And public goods means there's no incentive for people to go invest by themselves because otherwise they can just free ride when someone else does it.
Right. What's an example of that?
An example of public goods like a road,
Mm-hmm.
like education, park,
Street lighting.
Yeah, yeah. So we need government for certain things in society. That's a good argument. Some of the things that you could argue in a debate is you could say that like the nation has failed a certain group of people. Let's say it's like African Americans in America because of like slavery and entrenched racism in policy, and that they owe the poorest of the poor, which is usually drawn along racial lines, those people support and subsidy in order to bring them out of their poverty that was induced historically by the government. And then you have a duty to them for that reason. There's also the lottery of birth, which we've gone through, and then there's the argument that we've just fleshed out is the government is the only actor with the ability or like the capability to deliver those services for everyone, and we want to live in a society where that exists. Now, can anyone come up with arguments for why we would like a really small government? Andrew.
So a lot of the small government arguments come from an idea that people should have the ability to choose between a whole range of options with things like their medical cover or their education, that it shouldn't all be simply decided by the government, that if people want to go into religious schools or schools that teach curriculums in a particular way, that's their right, and having a government with the control of those things doesn't allow for that. Also, governments can be extremely inefficient because market forces don't act on them to enforce the efficiency necessary for innovation, etc., etc., etc. I'm sure you can figure this out more.
It's like listening to the dictionary. Rowan.
No, it's not just that markets can be inefficient, but they also, because bureaucracies are made out of people, those people within them often have their own incentives. So, for instance, you might design an education policy that's good for your friends, but isn't necessarily, or for instance, friends in the teacher union movement, and not an education policy that's good for students.
Right.
Hypothetically.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
There's also, of course, just the argument that anything the government does must ultimately be paid for through taxation, and that taxation is a dampener on business, on people's lives, and their ability to spend money the way they want, etc., etc., etc.
Cool. Shara?
Is it possible to stand for small government, but like not defence for economic?
Yeah, absolutely. Just more efficient government in a lot of senses, or just like arguing we don't want any defence, or we only want a small amount of defence, but we were happy to prioritise having really good healthcare, really good education system.
Yeah, there are small government solutions for a lot of problems, like, for example, in education, you can use a voucher system rather than government controlling schools. It gives poor people vouchers to go to private schools, where they can still have that choice, where the free market can still operate on those schools, but where the government doesn't have that level of control, and yet it still provides some subsidy for the poorest.
And that's why I put a little spectrum down the bottom, is because you have like,
Is that what
you
that
can,
is?
yes, it's the implicit spectrum. Right. Now let's see what Margaret Thatcher has to say.
One of the great debates of our time is about how much of your money should be spent by the state and how much you should keep to spend on your family. Let us never forget this fundamental truth. The state has no source of money other than the money people earn themselves. If the state wishes to spend more, it can do so only by borrowing your savings or by taxing you more. And it's no good thinking that someone else will pay. That someone else is you. There is no such thing as public money. There is only taxpayers' money.
Okay, cool.
She certainly knows how to appeal to conservatives.
Yes, it's very conservative, the arguments for small government. So basically what Margaret Thatcher said, it's the government is spending your money and it's better that you spend that money rather than the government. Another argument is privatization is a really good thing, and to a large extent it is. For example, the government used to own the Commonwealth Bank, Australia Post, Telstra, Qantas, and governments all around the world actually owned a large proportion of their economies for fear of like foreign ownership and that sort of thing. Privatization and like liberal free market economics means that other companies can come in and compete with those companies, and what happens in competition is that your price goes down because the customers will go to the best service with the lowest cost, the lowest price, and this ultimately means that customers in Australia will get a better deal in a situation that doesn't have a monopoly on it. Yes?
Where does welfare fit into the big government, small government situation?
Sure. So welfare is pretty much a big government idea that you want to provide a lot of welfare for people. So if you like welfare, you like big government. But you can also like small government in some circumstances, like you can be for privatizing inefficient monopolies, like Telstra used to be, but still like want all those sorts of good social benefits like tax breaks for disadvantaged people or subsidies. And that's the spectrum where you sit, and you can sit on anywhere you like in life and in debating. So ultimately, what is best for society? The question is, do we pay to help people, or do we pay less and only help some people? And in the middle is kind of where like Australia sits, and some of other countries you can infer on that. So let's look at price change debates. Yes. What are price change debates? It's usually where in a debate that the model suggests that you do something that's going to move people around or change the way that they live, or it's going to affect commodities that they really need and rely on, like houses. So when you're moving people for like urbanization, let's say the topic is that we're going to remove welfare for people on remove the welfare for people in rural communities or communities that have no prospect of getting a job. Then the motion would require you to like move people to areas where they would be getting a job in order, that's like what you want to be solving. So can anyone think of arguments for, let's start, I'll give it like for why like moving, like what will happen when you move people? Who can like characterize what will happen?
Where?
Yes, from like poor places without a job, or
from like rural communities into a single big city.
yeah, let's say that. You could also, yeah.
We're talking about this in a first world or third world context.
Well, same difference.
Yes, yeah, sure.
First world, let's go first.
Let's go first world.
We're not supposed to call it that anymore.
So what you have, because people are moving, so in wherever you put it, wherever people are moving out from, house prices are going to fall because there's now less people wanting to buy in a given house. So wherever people are moving to, house prices are going to go up because there are more people that are going to move there. That's of course assuming that the amount of houses is going to stay the same. That's obviously going to be true in the places where the people are moving away from. That's not necessarily true in the places that people are moving to.
Mm-hmm. And the little box down here says that these debates are usually about characterizing stakeholders. Some of the stakeholders in that sort of debate could be like the community that they're leaving, the community that they're entering, or the people that are moving, and how it's going to affect them. So can anyone tell me like why, like how would you be affected as a person that's moving? That's a great, Rowan, you like nailed the practical on the head. What about like a principled approach, or like What are some of the harms to a person when they're moving from the country to the city?
You'll get homesick.
Yes, flesh it out.
Alright, so the way you used to live in a country, like the skills and way of living you used to have may not be applicable to where you are.
Mm-hmm.
So, is there any jobs you'd have to have?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So your skills might not be applicable in the big city. Also that like you lose your community, your social network, your family, the links and ties that you have in that community to a completely new location. Like if you move to New York, you would probably struggle and maybe end up in poverty, and that's really bad for that person. That's a harm for them. Also the buying and the selling the homes that Andrew came up with on the weekend. Can anyone explain or tell me what gentrification is?
When an area like Collingwood used to be very working class and then it ends up becoming like trendy and then it gets more services and then the house prices go up and makes it harder for the people who've always lived there to afford their house prices, but it also improves the area.
Awesome. Yeah, that's pretty spot on. It's where rich people move to a poor location and they improve that location, but it also crowds out the poorer people living in that area. For example, the house prices go up, and if you're renting, your rent prices go up, and you can't afford to live there because also food prices go up, and you end up having to move out of that location. Or if you own a house, you could characterize it that they get also very rich. So it's how you characterize it, pricing out the locals, and then how does getting a job change in that circumstance, or the schools in that area, or healthcare change? Who can tell me, perhaps, when you have a gentrified area, what happens to the job market in a gentrified area? Andrew.
Well, generally it changes, and it changes to cater for those who have the most wealth to spend on places of business within that area, which is usually going to be the rich. So minimum wage jobs often get crowded out in exchange for more specialised jobs, and so instead of having Walmart or Coles, whatever, you have boutique stores and delis that serve extremely expensive food and stuff. In terms of things like schools and healthcare, often you get private schools moving in, or even you get things like very, very well-to-do public schools that is nevertheless extremely difficult to get into if you can't afford to give your kid a lot of attention for tutoring or for just helping with homework so that they get the grades necessary to go in there, as well as specialised health clinics that often cost more, etc., etc. In terms of the other way, I guess, if a lot of people are moving from rural areas just to urban areas, you can also potentially paint that as a good thing, because healthcare, schools, a lot of welfare are things that do benefit from economies of scale, so taking people away from areas where it's very hard to reach them with those services and putting them all in concentrated locations can sometimes be good as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you did a really good job of that. Let's move on to the next topic, which is the minimum wage. So who can tell me some stakeholders that you think will be important in a minimum wage debate? So we're changing the minimum wage, perhaps we're lowering it.
Oh, sorry. Can I go back to gentrification for just a second?
Yeah, no worries.
So I've never seen a rent control debate play out. But is rent control possibly used as a mechanism to combat gentrification, or is it used as
It's usually a secondary effect of gentrification, that rent goes up, but if you want to if the model is that we would allow rent control, that poor people can get subsidized rent, that could be a modeling out some of the harms, if you like.
Yeah. Usually, rent control is usually put in to combat some of the effects of gentrification, but the efficacy of it is just
Well, the
dubious.
forces that push the gentrification in the first place are still there, so it really just slows down the gentrification and makes it hurt less for the extremely poor in that area, I guess.
Okay, minimum wage. Who would be affected if we lowered the minimum wage in Australia? By the way, Australia has one of the highest, by some spectrums, by some analysis, the highest minimum wage in the world. Yay. Yes, yay for us, because we usually get the minimum wage. That was a little hint, maybe. Who gets affected when we lower the minimum wage? In a bad way.
People earning it.
Yeah.
Yes. How?
Well, because the protection on their wage to be at a certain threshold no longer exists, and their employers can re-advertise their jobs or just offer it back to the same person at a much lower rate.
So that's really good. It's really good. Why is that bad for society?
So individuals who don't have discretionary spending money can't stimulate the economy. They have a subsistence level income.
Absolutely. Yep. And then why is that perhaps bad for the businesses themselves?
Less customers.
Why?
Less people who can afford their things.
Yeah, fewer people with discretionary income.
Yeah. Usually you can argue that business is probably less productive with less skilled staff, because what happens when you have higher wages is you get to buy the more intelligent staff that can do more productive things. That's just for business, but your other analysis was spot on. But let's look at why minimum wage, let's look at the other side of that. So increasing, having a high minimum wage, you can argue, in Barack Obama's Jobs Act speech on why minimum wage is, part of it was why minimum wage should be higher in the US, is that we shouldn't be in a race to the bottom where we offer the lowest wages, the worst standards to work in, and the cheapest factories to run. We should be in a race to the top, which offers the best wages, the most intelligent workforce, and the people that are having a really good lifestyle when they work. That's the kind of economy that you want to prioritize for your nation, and that's kind of called a knowledge economy. Australia is often called a knowledge economy, if you follow business, because Australians are well-educated people that provide financial services, that provide mining as well. That's what we're known for. But with the majority of highly skilled jobs and an economy that sells its intelligence to other countries in exchange for perhaps some of the, we can design robots to make the things that we don't want to make ourselves. And it's still a great thing for our country. And we don't want a country that has low minimum wages because it results in things like sweatshops. It results in poor quality environments for people to work in. And that kind of leads on to how this is bad for employees, is that by giving them smaller wages, they can't afford to have very good lifestyles. For example, in the US, when a full-time Macca's worker is on $7.25 and the living expenses for the day only just cover the amount of money you get, you can't afford things like healthcare, you can't afford things like giving your kids an education or doing anything but working all the time. It's a form of wage slavery. It's a form of impoverishing people in a systematic level. And then lastly, the more business is more productive with higher workers, but probably not the most relevant stuff. I'd say the most important stuff is employees get better off, and that's the society we want to live in.
Also, depending on how much wages drop by, you might get less funding from unions given that they're typically paid for by people's wages.
True. Why would society or people care about? Why is that harmful?
When you lower or remove the minimum wage, unions are pretty much the only mechanism in place to sort of prevent employer abuse or dismissal of low-skilled employees.
Absolutely. Kelvin?
Yeah, conversely though, wouldn't you say that given that they're being exploited so much, they would be more they would have a greater incentive to form unions to increase their bargaining power?
But you still have to pay for them.
Yeah, but it's that once you get to a certain level, maybe when it's lowered a bit, you might want a union, but once it gets to a certain level and you have enough to exist, you can't afford to give some of it to the unions.
Yeah, unions still need to do things like hire lawyers.
You can want the union as much as you like. If you can't afford it, then you're
And also, an argument for lowering the minimum wage is that a whole lot more people get jobs, and really poor people that don't have skills, that can't compete in today's labor market, get jobs because they can, yes, it's less productive, but poorer people get jobs, and that's good because they get some money rather than never getting a job at all. Andrew, are you going to say something?
Just in terms of why it's a good thing potentially to have a high minimum wage, is that it's about designing what sort of economy you want. In terms of Australia, having an economy that constantly demands demands high-skilled labour because of the high minimum wage, that gives people the greater incentive to choose to go to uni rather than choose to enter the workforce immediately, which means that as a whole, Australia has access to a much higher base level of education, which means it's much easier to design their economy around providing services, hence knowledge economy.
Cool, yeah, absolutely. So ultimately, these sort of price change debates, when you're changing something unnaturally in an economy, it's basically who is affected, the stakeholder, why, like, tell us if they win or lose, and then to what degree are they harmed or benefited under your model, will usually give you like strong material in a debate. Nathan?
So I have a question without notice to Tom.
Tom, okay.
So we were in the World's Trials debate last year, which was the minimum wage debate, abolishing the minimum wage, and you somehow kept the welfare as is in your model, but just got rid of the minimum wage. And then at OG, and then at OO, we were like, we kept trying to attack you on like, well, is this doing anything, because you're still having why would someone pick up a job for nothing when they can get the welfare as is? And I was wondering if you could explain just quickly about, and if I've misrepresented that, then feel free.
You've lost me a little. Are you talking about the argument that even without a minimum wage, the incomes can't descend below welfare?
No. Well, you kept sort of like, unemployment. You didn't go full libertarian on ours.
How do you defend successfully a motion that makes you defend, like getting rid of the minimum wage? Like, how do you win that?
Sure. You can say that like in a society that is really poor, like Africa, that having a high minimum wage isn't beneficial to them, because that means that like so many of the poor people in that society will never be able to get a job because they're not like capable of, like they don't have the skills in order to like be that one productive worker at Starbucks versus like the 10 people that you might otherwise get, or maybe not Starbucks, in like a factory that like one person, or like they can afford to replace you with a machine because now your wage is so much more expensive. Or Andrew?
So yeah, there's a whole bunch of that stuff, and you can use a lot of rhetoric here in saying like it's really easy for a room full of people with university degrees to say the minimum wage is great, but for people who are less privileged than us, who don't have those same advantages in the job market, who apply and again are rejected because there are not enough jobs in that market to sustain them, then getting a bigger job market, even at the cost of some people's wages, specifically our entitled privilege wages, is perfectly acceptable. And it should be people's right to be able to decide what contracts they are applied to. It's not something the government should have a say in, but it's an individual's own responsibility and own right to decide what their own labour is worth to them. It's not something the government can decide for them. And if they want to trade off better working conditions for a higher wage, or get those better working conditions in exchange for a lower wage, that's something that they're perfectly capable of doing themselves, and we do not need government to step in. And in particular, when this allows for the economy to grow at its fastest rate, that's probably going to create more taxation revenue that we can put towards things like welfare. That's how we get the best results here. But let's bring this down to actually resolve this today.
All right.
The number of people on minimum wage is vastly lower than the number of people unemployed. When you want to care about one of those stakeholders, when you want to disadvantage one at the expense of the advantages of the other, we should always be prioritizing the unemployed rather than those who got that minimum wage job. They are a larger group, and they are the lesser privileged group. That's who we stand for.
Andrew, we're like a third of the way.
All right. Okay. Central banks. What are they? They do monetary policy. They are an independent body that supplies the country, that controls the supply of money in a country. So what they do is they print money and they lend it to the government and banks. So examples of this are in the US, there's the Federal Reserve. In Europe, there's the European Central Bank. In Australia, there's a Reserve Bank. Every single country has a central bank. Why are they important? They directly control key parts of our economy, like interest rates, exchange rates, and inflation. I'm not going to explain how they do it, just know that they do it. Also, they play a crucial role in financial crises. They also affect the economy based on employment and trade. So their aims as a central bank, this is like every single central bank wants to have stable prices within that economy. They want to have high economic growth and high employment. They're generally the aims of the central bank. So just a bit of knowledge about how they're appointed. This is for the should we elect our central bankers debate. In the US, the president appoints the members of the board, and then they're confirmed by the Senate, and they sit for 14 years. Why is it important how long a central banker is a central banker? Why is that important?
Because that's how long the maximum amount of time they can screw up for before you get rid of them.
That's true.
Also, in terms of the 14-year serving, it often means that they're not particularly political because they don't align with a single term for president or for the Senate, etc.
Absolutely, yeah, because we don't want central bankers that are in the interests of conservatives or liberals one way or the other. Can anyone tell me why 14 years is particularly important? It's a really long time, yes. Because it's a really long time, it means that they're not going to be influenced by big business or the president or Senate and their agendas, and because they're probably never going to get elected again, right? So they have no incentive in order to do what other people want them to do. But let's look at Australia. The Treasurer himself appoints the Governor every 7 years, and then every other member, the 9 members, every 5 years. And they're made up from people from the Treasury or from APRA. Now, the Treasurer has no Senate to confirm or anything like that, so the Treasurer himself elects these people. This is where Australia example can be a little bit more controversial, can build your case a little bit more, because 7 years is a lot shorter than 14 years, and the fact that some people do get re-elected again, and that you want to do what the Treasurer tells you because you can get thrown out, or the 9 members who control the balance of power within the Central Bank of Australia, the Reserve Bank, can be replaced if you don't do what the government wants you to do.
Do you know where the numbers 7 and 5 come from? Because that's not the length of an average election cycle.
Yeah.
Do you know the rationale behind it?
It's really ages ago, 1935, it was put in legislation. I don't know why they did it in 1935, sorry. But yeah, so what happened in the 1990s? Can anyone tell me about the recession that we had to have in the 1990s? It was a recession for 2 years that we had to have. It was basically to deal with inflation. In Australia, we had about 20% inflation, and what the Treasurer and the head of the central bank at the time did was they caused a recession in Australia purely to deal with inflation. And that just shows the control that the Treasurer and the central bankers have, that they can force the country into a recession, a deep recession, for 2 years in order to do whatever they want. That's just a little bit of background. So they aren't very independent, central bankers, but they do generally a good job. It was arguably a good thing that we had a recession because inflation's a bad thing, or however you want to skew it. I'm not going to get into that. But we elect the people who ultimately control central banks, and that's what you can say is but we already elect the people who control central banks. Why do we have to elect central bankers? It's just going to mean that people make worse decisions. It's like electing judges. People make worse decisions about central bankers because they have to campaign for populist reasons rather than merit. Yes?
So, 2 stupid questions. 1, what's APRA? 2, who is in the Treasury?
Sure, absolutely. So, APRA is just another government department, part of all the government departments. They regulate things. The Treasury is the government body that spends money and taxes people in Australia. So they represent the financial arm of the government.
Does APRA regulate any specific things or just things in general?
I don't want to get into it because it's not important. All right.
Then why is it
IP, patents. So what are patents? Patents are legal monopolies, and this is often mischaracterized, that they are mostly for 20 years. So drug companies get patents, all sorts of patents. They're usually for 20 years. That's on an international stage. So what can you do with a patent? You can withhold that technology from society for 20 years. You can charge whatever price you want for the cure to cancer or for eternal youth. I can charge $1 billion for that, and I will get a couple of buyers. Or I could give it out for free. What are some arguments for why we should have no patents or no intellectual property?
Utility.
Tell me about that.
Well, for example, when you have a monopoly over a certain drug that would help people, like that would help cure a lot of different sicknesses, it's better for more people to have access to that drug. Mm-hmm. However, if you put a patent on it, it means that the use of that drug to cure or treat a certain illness would be reserved for the wealthy and those who can afford it.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Can anyone else come up with reasons? Yes?
Well, to add on to that is how we cured polio.
Yes.
But also there's incentive for companies to hold on to those patents, and they don't necessarily need to actually do anything with them. And you have in the United States where you have courts that are very friendly towards patent giving, granting, whatever. Especially in technology, especially in things like IT, I believe. Like Microsoft was a big concern at one time. They can store up all these things and prevent people from
like the electric car, when oil companies can buy green technology and crush the competition and then sell their oil products or their drugs that will not be effective if this intellectual property went to market and everyone got access to it. They can hold that back from society, and that can really be bad for society because that's a bad thing. So usually these debates come down to which side gets innovation the best. Who can tell me why innovation is good?
New things, better things.
Why are they good? Yes.
Well, in terms of the debate, it enables you to massively inflate any of your benefits because they become functionally infinite.
True.
You're not just supplying the cures to diseases we currently have, you're also creating new and better cures for other diseases, etc., etc. And so the scale of benefit that you can claim once you win innovation is much larger.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think perhaps one of the more palatable examples is that when drugs that can cure or that can vaccinate all these poor people in, say, Africa and save heaps and heaps of lives, that's probably a big harm that you want to characterize and say that we save millions of people more than they save millions of people. So let's look at sort of some of the reasons why we would like patents. Actually, I've kind of said it in the reverse order, but let's just go to yes, you get to say big companies like to control technology that can compete with them. This is not very good for our markets or for the amount of innovation we get in society. And then the next thing you could say is we still get heaps of innovation under our world because you get a first mover advantage. First mover advantage is where you put the product out first, you get brand recognition, you get heaps of profits, you're there before your competitors, you make all the money for a couple years. Yes, Andrew?
You could also potentially run arguments that patent law has gotten so arcane, so overdone, that now it's actually something that makes innovation very difficult because it's virtually impossible to work out what has and hasn't been patented with regards to advanced technologies, which is why Google and Apple and Samsung and Microsoft can all be suing each other for infringing the same patents all simultaneously.
You can also patent things that are through no effort of your own creative work, a certain shade of purple is something that Cadbury has patented.
Aren't there companies in America which are patent trolls? Which just sort of
all companies in America.
All companies in general.
They just sort of go around suing random people.
Yes. Just to crush their business because you can.
Apple has that rubber band effect from when you swipe on an iPhone screen.
Yeah. So also the countless legislation that this litigation that this creates is really inefficient. But Nathan touched on something really important, and that was the cure for polio. And just listen to the first part of what this YouTube video says, because that's important. Hey. Okay, so the first part is the only speaking part The rest is emotional. Just listen to the first part.
Who owns the patent on this vaccine? Well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?
Oh! Okay, so that was just an example of how not patenting something is quite good for people. And just notice that is called, like, that scientist Salk, it's the Salk vaccine, and that, like, he gets credit for that, and that, like, that fame associated with developing that drug is also an incentive for scientists to make drugs, or, like, things like that. All right, so arguments for having a patent, and this is, like, why do we actually have patents in the real world? So in order to cover the costs of research and development for drugs and for all sorts of things, you need to have that monopoly protection in order to pay for that research and development for the next drug and for the next innovation. Also that, like, the higher reward, the fact that Apple could protect its intellectual property for 20 years meant that Steve Jobs was incentivized in order to create the Apple II and to actually, like, be a groundbreaking entrepreneur in that particular field, making waves of innovation for everyone else. We also say that, like, big business, because they get that monopoly, because they have all that money, they have bigger economies of scale, and that means that they can get a greater reward for greater amount of innovation out there because they're so big. Also, you can just say, like, 20 years is not that long of a period of time before, like, innovation gets out to everyone and it's free game. And you can...
That 20 years includes the research and development of a product, doesn't it?
I think it's after the patent's filed.
Not sure. I can't tell you.
Well, it's after the patent's filed, but if you, for instance, have discovered a new gene that you want to turn into a cure, you patent it when you discover the gene, not when you've turned it into the cure.
Yes, Andrew.
I'm just slightly confused about the they can withhold the idea from society part. I'm fairly certain the whole idea behind patents was the government will give you a monopoly over an idea, but in exchange you have to release that idea publicly so that there is a record of that idea.
I think what he means is that, like, other companies can't use it.
Yes.
Yeah. But the point is that idea is still out there, like the technology is still publicly available and can be studied and innovated from. You just can't make a profit from it for 20 years.
Yeah.
And one of the arguments for patents is the converse of that is people just have trade secrets and nobody knows how any of the stuff is manufactured. Nobody knows the ingredients of these drugs at all. And that might not actually be a better thing for innovation.
Yeah, and that's why Coca-Cola never patents its secret recipe ingredients. Or you could say that, like...
Pepsi won the Cola Wars, though.
And you can say that because, like, ExxonMobil stole the patent for the electric car, now after 20 years we can have electric cars, which is a great thing.
I read something interesting actually last year. I think Tesla decided to open up its patents to everyone. It said, which is obviously nice for Tesla because they're the market leader in that particular industry. But it's a bold move, obviously, to say if anyone wants to have a go,
you
we're
can
not going to sue you.
argue that what Tesla is doing is just making a shrewd business decision
Yeah,
in
I mean,
that
obviously
having
it's a
electric cars requires a huge amount of infrastructure. The more companies making them, the more likely that infrastructure will be developed. So it's actually good for them in the long run. Yeah.
Business.
Yeah. So there are incentives to do those things.
All right, debt and market panic. Why do we have debt in society? Basically because every one of us can now borrow with very little wealth, like background wealth or security behind us, that we can like buy a house, or that we can buy other things, that we can buy things on a credit card. And this means that we buy lots more stuff in society, which means that society grows at a very fast pace compared to a world where I can't buy anything because I have no money and I have to work all of my life to afford something. So what happens when that system fails, where we're just buying lots of stuff out of debt? It's usually because like the interest rate or how expensive it is to borrow is really low. And you can also like borrow huge amounts, like what happened in the GFC, the ninja loans, where people that didn't have any security or had no prospect of paying back that loan could borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars. This leads, yes, Andrew?
Just to like put that in, I guess, a little bit more detail, the calculation you make when you borrow money is, will I be able to put that money to such use that the return on that will exceed the cost of that debt in terms of its interest? With things like houses, if the prices of houses generally rise, then you can probably sell that house for later for more than the interest on your debt, and so you made a profit and that debt was a good decision. The problem comes when the rise in that price is sort of no longer actually related to the value of the house at all. It's just related to the idea that somebody else is now going to borrow money to buy that house for its larger price, and then it's going to keep growing because they trust that somebody else is now going to borrow more money to buy that house. And that's where you get a bubble, where the rise in price is not actually associated with a rising value of the thing we're talking about. And the problem is that that thing is unsustainable in the long run, and eventually, boom.
Yes, yes. Thus, boom and bust cycles, just like Andrew explains. So what happens when a bust happens, right? Everyone decides that like asset prices are decreasing, and that when they see that the price of their shares are going down, and they think that something bad is it's going to go even further in the future, they decide to sell today because they think it's going to be worse tomorrow. And by selling today, and everyone selling today, it becomes worse tomorrow. That's called a loss of confidence. What a loss of confidence does is it means that the price, stock prices and other asset prices fall dramatically, and that reveals a lot of other problems in an economy. So there might be like really poor policy done by the government, like in the Southeast 1997 Southeast Asia crisis. A lot of the governments failed because their loss of confidence happened, but then the structural problems around the way that they're just funneling money into construction companies or whatever it is was exposed, and those companies went bankrupt, and they were so close to the state that those governments need to be bailed out. And then, if you look at the case of, say, Enron, they were like one of the largest businesses in the world, and then they just said that they were making all of this money, and they actually weren't. And then when a financial crisis came along, they couldn't pay their debts, and they went bankrupt, and it was horrible for them. And then what happens when one big business or a big government, when a big business fails, is because that big business is in so many other countries that the failure of that big business affects all of those other countries. And this is the interconnectedness of markets. This is globalization, that even though the GFC started in America, it negatively affected Europe significantly more than America. And then lastly, this idea about too big to fail. Can anyone explain what too big to fail means? Calvin.
It essentially becomes about moral hazard. That is to say, because the banks, such as in the recent global financial crisis, have become so central to the economy, the US government had to step in to save them.
Yeah, yeah.
So they went and took more risks as a result of that.
Yeah, because if a bank failed and that had all of the savings of half the population in it, all of the people would lose all of their savings, and that would mean that no one could buy anything, and the economy would have gone into a deep depression, like in the depression of the 1930s, when banks actually did fail. And then you can argue that for banks, you can argue that for big companies, and pretty much any really big company is too big to fail because of the external shocks to other places, to the people that they had, like their employees and the people that hold money because of them. Arguably, things are too big to fail. Big businesses. All right. this is not the end of my slide, but I moved it up because it's so really important. If you want to learn about economics, go to the Economist YouTube channel. It is the cheesiest way to find like good like economic knowledge about stuff. Like, for example, the first video.
When it started life as an independent, separate country in 1965, Singapore's prospects did not look good. Tiny and underdeveloped, it had no natural resources and a population of relatively recent immigrants with little shared history. The country's first Prime Minister, the late Lee Kuan Yew, is credited with transforming it. He called one volume of his memoirs From Third World to First. Why did Singapore become an economic success? First, its strategic location and natural harbour helped. It is at the mouth of the Malacca Strait, through which perhaps 40% of world maritime trade passes. It was
Yes, it's very interesting. They have a lot of very interesting things on their YouTube channel. I'll just quickly go back to it. This is what it looks like. It's the YouTube channel of The Economist. It teaches you stuff in really short amount of time. It's very debatory. Look at, there's Ebola, there's third world countries, there's China. Seriously guys, this is the best way to learn economics if you don't want to go and get an economics degree.
And they have really nice graphics on their videos as well.
Yeah, graphics. They do the week ahead and the week in review. They cover different elections. It's very topical, very to the point, very good. These are just some books recommended by these two. Was recommended to me by Victor Finkel. This one was Tim Sonnereich. These are all very debatory books. They're all really good. Highly recommend you watch them. Yes.
There's another book from Hajun Chang, which is a bit easier. I think it's called Economics, the User Guide. So that's a good.
Oh yeah, I read that one.
Yeah, cool. All right, let's cover the Bretton Woods system. All right, so in 1945, after World War II, all of the major countries that were pro-Western, not Russia, decided to come together and try to avert World War III, because what caused, ultimately the cause of World War I and II was massive instability of countries, not being able to pay their debts, just instability of countries because they were too poor or the big fluctuations in them. And so what these, Europe, all of Europe that was still a world power, anyone that was a world power after World War II, came together and created the IMF, the World Trade Organization, and the World Bank. So the IMF is the International Monetary Fund, and their aim is to stop financial crises happening in governments. So what they do is they lend governments money in order to pay their debts. Now, one of the most controversial parts of the IMF is that it is a $1, one vote system. So the country that controls the IMF or controls the policies of the IMF are the countries that lend countries the money. So it's the richest countries that lend to the poorest countries, and the poorest countries that get that money have to do what the IMF says in order to get more money from them to pay their loans, because they need continuous support from the IMF, otherwise they will go bankrupt. So what happened with Greece, when Greece was very topical and the GFC was happening, is they went to a referendum whether they should not pay the IMF loans. But what happened was that the IMF said, no, you cannot have that referendum, and otherwise we will pull out all of the money and you will collapse as an economy, and that will be massive harms. The Prime Minister resigned of Greece. I believe he was the Prime Minister, whatever their head of state was. And it completely violated their sovereignty. The IMF constantly violates the sovereignty of countries by demanding of them structural reforms, by demanding of them various other things that they have to achieve in order to get more money from the IMF. So there's a big topical discussion about the IMF. The US controls 18% of all the money that goes into the IMF. They're the biggest voting bloc, more than most of Europe combined.
They actually have strategic veto.
Yes, they have veto power as well. yes, Andrew.
I just want to point out there's a podcast, it was either This American Life or Radiolab that did it, which went into the history of Bretton Woods and what actually went on there, and all of the evidence that the only reason the other countries agreed to this system is because the US delegation got them all drunk and they did not actually understand what they were signing.
They had to get them drunk for that?
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah, well,
also, the guy who was heading that delegation for the US and who got them to sign that in the US interest turned out later to be a Soviet spy. So, international financial institutions.
Not a very good one, obviously. He just gave them a shit.
All right. World Trade Organization, a lot less controversial. But what basically you do when you join the World Trade Organization, it is less controversial than the IMF, relative, it regulates trade. It says that anyone who signs into the World Trade Organization can no longer increase their tariffs. This was originally just an agreement not to increase your tariffs. It turned into the World Trade Organization. That's the World Trade Organization. The next one is the World Bank. Now, what they're branded out as the Reconstruction and Development Bank. What they do is they target the third world or like poor countries, and they provide them with poverty alleviation funding. So this is funding for infrastructure, for your roads, for your dams, for your utilities, and they can help a lot of like poorer countries stop poverty.
Where do they get their money from?
They get money from all of the countries that sign on to the World Bank, that fund the World Bank. So in the same way that the IMF gets money from like the US, from China, from like European countries, then they use the IMF and World Bank to funnel that to other countries. Yes, Andrew?
And China is basically setting up a rival version of like all of these. Yeah, and Australia just signed on.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Yeah, so the UK, France and Germany. Taiwan's tried to sign on to it, so there's been a bit of a shit fight.
Fun times.
Yeah, one key difference between the World Bank and the IMF is that the loans given out by the IMF are non-concessional, but which means like that they're not very generous in terms of their interest, although World Bank loans are concessional loans, which means that they're a lot more softer and generous in the way in which that they're lending out money.
They have different aims, though.
Yes.
So IMF loans are generally during a particularly unstable period during an economy. They try to preserve it and endure that, whereas World Bank loans are more explicitly about developing countries, natural resource extraction projects.
Yeah. All right. The development timeline. This is based off Ross Steed's Stages of Growth. Tim Sonnereich did a session on this before Australs last year. Basically, what it says is that like countries go through broadly 5 stages. I've condensed it down to 4 of their sort of like transformation into a first world country. What you have is like a traditional subsistence lifestyle. Then you develop the basic infrastructure and utilities and various government reforms in order to ensure that businesses can survive there and that like people can trade, and that creates conditions where you get a takeoff in the middle here, where urbanization and industrialization and global investment happens, and then ultimately you get the best living standards and a society of mass consumption. So you could say that countries like Europe and Australia and the US sit somewhere up here. China and India are still developing. They've got lots of urbanization and development going on, and then you've got more sort of like structurally unsound countries, perhaps Zimbabwe or the Congo, where they don't really have the utilities and the infrastructure down pat. So this is kind of, you can characterize like where a country is and where they need to go, and you could say like your model is the next step in getting to the best living standards and mass consumption. So that's the development timeline. Now, free trade or no free trade? Can anyone tell me what the infant industry argument is?
So, like sub-Saharan African nations can't possibly compete with the technology or the state assistance provided with Western nations on like an open market free trade. So they need the government to step in and protect them.
Yep. Basically, yes. So Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers of the United States, came up with the infant industry argument, which was that like US businesses, this was back when they were founded, the US, could not compete with European manufacturing, European companies, And what they needed to do was protect their local businesses and industry so that they could grow big and strong and then compete on a global scale with those other businesses. But to do that, you have to have high tariffs, you have to have like all sorts of regulation that makes that's like ineffective. Those are people on the ground in that country will suffer because it's not like as competitive. But ultimately, you get big businesses and that industry will thrive for you. Examples of this are like South Korea, where Sam's like the South Korean government heavily invested in things like Pyeonghang, iron and steel, or like Samsung, and those companies became really big under protectionism, and then they've been able to go out to the rest of the world, and that's been really good for South Korea for a variety of reasons, having those like domestic, because all the profits flow back to South Korea. The US has done this with Boeing, with their railroad, like they used to have railroad companies. I don't know what they have anymore, or like the UK. So the argument is that like the government is the only person who can create an industry, like a domestic, like who can create big business for that country, and that if you just allow other big businesses to come in, that they'll leave and that they'll just like steal all the profits out of there, and they may behave unethical, whereas if you have a domestically run business, that's good for you. Can anyone tell me the free market sort of version of free trade? Why is free trade good?
Trade liberalization lowers trade barriers. That makes it easier for developing nations to access the technology being exported by developed nations, and therefore it is better and easier for them themselves to develop. Absolutely,
yes. Cool. And the first world loves free trade because they have the big businesses that can go into other places and they get all the money from them. So the developed world says free trade is really good because you will get instant access to all the good things of being of trade, but they also used the infant industry argument when they were small, and this is reflected in like the World Trade Organization's policies, controlled by the first world, inflicted on the third world. The OECD is another example of this. So it's the most efficient, and because it gives you the lowest prices for everyone. So really, what is best for your country depends where you are on this timeline. Zimbabwe probably should have more protectionism. Australia wants free trade. Cool. Yes?
Just something to contribute, like, as a counterpoint to the infant industry examples you have there, in Malaysia they protected the car industry for a while, and the Malaysian national car, Proton, is still a pretty shit car.
Yeah.
And it's like barely surviving because it's really bad.
Yeah, and that was the same argument for Japanese cars, for protecting Toyota for 20, 30 years. It was horribly manufactured for a long, long time, but eventually, after like the longest period of time, that it got to be like the best, one of the best automotive factory companies in the world. I think I'm just going to leave it there because we should do debating now. You'll get more out of debating. Thank you.